What was the weirdest or creepiest neighbor you had? My current neighbor. He's old and I live in the country. He's about a 3-minute drive down the road from me and used to have a mailbox next to mine and would go through my mail then bring it to my door. He would steal my magazines then put them back a day or two later. I got a locking mailbox and then all of a sudden one day it fell over and he came over in a panic and told me that a locking mailbox is too heavy and I have to use a regular box. I called the sheriff on him and a few days later he got a new mailbox installed at his house. He would also go through my recycling then judge me based upon the amount of alcohol bottles he found. Funny thing is, I barely drink and tend to have a month or two's worth of bottles at a time, so he thought I was just going on an occasional bender. Finally one day he came over to tell me to clean my gutters and I told him to get the fuck out of my face and never come over uninvited again. He drove up a few days later and asked, "So when is that invite coming?" I thought my wife and I were supposed to be expecting an invite soon. I told him, "Never, get the fuck out of here, you creep me out." I had a really creepy neighbor. Probably early 40s male. I was 7th grade when I first met him. He was a very nice guy, but he just had something off about him. My mother is very patriotic. Our whole house was red, white and blue inside. One day walking home from school he is sitting in his front lawn and tells me he's having a red, white and blue sale in his backyard and I should check it out. I told him sure, but I need to go get money first and walked off. My neighbor directly to the side of me was a big guy, mid-30s, covered in prison tattoos, but had turned his life around, although very intimidating if you don't know him. Since my parents weren't home I went to his house and told him. He walked over to that guy's house with me and he took him to the backyard. Sure enough, it had red, white and blue items for sale. I still thought something was off. 2 years later he was arrested for attempting to get a child in his house. A guy named Sebald. He straight up smelled like tuna all the time. He'd come knock on our door to ask for random things in his robe, a rubber band, an apple slicer, a doorstop. Like probably once a week. My bedroom door faced his kitchen and sometimes I'd look over and see him laying on the floor. It was bizarre. Neighbors moved in across the street from me when I was in middle school. They were very odd people that kept to themselves. It was obvious they had 2 small children that were adopted. One day not that long after they moved in the lady came over and apologized to my parents that her kids were always screaming and crying. I remember it being really strange because neither my parents or myself ever really heard the kids screaming or crying. Not soon after that my father was home and he hears the lady screaming in her backyard. He goes over and she is screaming that she found the younger of her 2 children unresponsive in the backyard. Police arrive and unfortunately the kid is dead. Then things get real. Tons of cops, unmarked vehicles, police lines. Looks a movie to middle school me. Turns out she beat the kid to death and tried to stage it like the kid fell and hit his head on the back patio. Then we find out much more. Our new neighbors moved out of their last house because they weren't welcome in the area because numerous previous neighbors reported them to Child Protective Services for abuse. We find out it was literally a local news story in the area they lived in. Now this is in the 1980s before internets and all that, so you could hide your skeletons much easier back then. They only lived across from us a few months before this went down. Pretty shitty story. Oh, and one more thing. The murder charge / investigation revealed the children weren't even legitimately and legally adopted. They were basically purchased. My upstairs neighbor is always taking his trash out whenever I am. It may seem like an innocent coincidence, but the pinpoint accuracy of his timing is terrifying. I wonder if he thinks the same about me. When I was young and broke, I lived next to an apartment full of Listerine bums. I opened the door to one of them blowing the other in the hallway. I shit you not, the smell was still in the air hours later. Next door neighbor had a Corvette, and one night I awoke to flashing lights and a squad car on his lawn. I assumed someone had been caught stealing the car and went back to bed. Another neighbor asked me the next day if I knew what happened. I said I assumed someone was caught stealing the car, and the other neighbor told me that the guy's girlfriend committed suicide. The next day the couch was sitting on the lawn with a blood stain on it and stayed there for a couple of days. The neighbor moved out shortly after. Several years later the district attorney stopped by our house and asked us if we were friends with the neighbor, which we said no, as we only had just moved in. We said, "You are talking about the guy whose girlfriend committed suicide." He said it definitely was not suicide. I lived in an apartment building and would hear weird scratching at my door, like someone was trying to get in at night. Then someone knocking at my door. I answered that exactly 2 times because the dude terrified me. He would show up wearing nothing but an open bathrobe and wanted to just talk. I actually called the cops the second time he knocked and gave them the whole story. A 20-year-old girl living on her own and some middle-aged man trying to get into her apartment? Scary. The cops and landlady must have worked together to get that guy to back off, cause after calling the cops he stopped coming by. My former neighbor's son. He was a big-time drug addict. He was constantly arguing with his elderly mother, and there have been more than a few times that the cops have been called on him. There was one occasion when I was 16 and my friend was 13, and he was trying to lure us over to his house. Luckily we did not go. In grad school I lived next to a marijuana grow house. They kept a dog chained up outside 100% of the time in the backyard. They would come by once every couple days to work and feed the dog, but that's it. Another neighbor wanted to give the dog some blankets on a particularly cold night and hopped the fence. They had eyes on the house and 2 cars came screaming into the driveway minutes later. No violence or anything, she just put the blankets in the doghouse and gave them a little piece of her mind. The whole situation was pretty lame / sketchy / sad. A guy who just goes outside and stands in our shared woods, but closer to our property line than his own house, and snaps twigs for hours. Every day. Sometimes even at night in the pitch black. Shit drives me nuts. The neighbor that I never knew. For ages thought it was a witness protection house or drug related, but have no idea to this day. A family moved out of said house. Then, prior to next residents moving in, a heap of work was done on house. Most notably, the biggest fence I have ever seen was erected around the property. Not only that, the existing fences were extended in height, with the rear fence not only having an extension, but barbed wire added as well. The cars and vans of multiple security firms were seen coming and going as work continued on the place. Still, it appeared to the rest of us that no one had officially moved in. A guy sat in a car directly outside said house for over 6 hours by himself one day. A drone was seen flying overhead around the same period. Heaps of mail would build up in their mailbox. Occasionally the supposed residents would be seen dropping in, as if only temporarily. Then one day, a remivalist truck appeared there. We thought they were finally moving in officially after 2 years, but items were coming out. When you throw in the fact it is a government-owned house, things get a little stranger. When I was a little girl, like 10, I had this grown man neighbor that spanked me every time I saw him when I was playing outside. Just one swift slap, like, daily. It was obviously only when my parents weren't around, but it was incredibly inappropriate. So maybe not creepy so much as pedophile, why, but still. Growing up there was a middle-aged lady lived across the road with her young daughter. Every day I'd see her walk down the road carrying 2 large laundry bags, and later she'd return with them. Did this almost every day. I was curious how just the 2 of them needed to do so much laundry so frequently. Years later my mum told me the lady had been a refugee from Nazi Germany. She was terrified she'd leave the house and the Nazis would raid it when she was out. So she carried all of her clothes with her, always, everywhere. When I was 7, our next door neighbor came pounding on our front door to scream at and threaten to kill my dad because our pet that we kept in our backyard was being too loud. The pet was a rabbit. A rabbit. I had a neighbor that lived next door. His wife and family lived 20 minutes away. He kept the apartment, so he didn't have to commute, and had lived there for 10 years prior to me moving in. His wife would drop by and stay with him for a few days, about once a year. Maybe once a month he would go back to her place on the weekend. All hours of the night he would come up the stairs in the building. We were the only 2 apartments in the building, dragging stuff. Clunk, clunk, clunk up the steps. He used to accuse other people of stealing his mail, accused me of messing with his cable. He had a plastic runner that went from his front door to his bed. And milk crate kind of furniture. I learned this because when he moved out he invited me over to take anything in his place. It was mostly empty. One night he went on a rant about how when he goes to the grocery store and saw all the food there, it made him sick. Just sick. He started yelling while he was telling me this. Said he only ate pickles. He would just buy pickles at the store. He was a utility worker. Classic serial killer job. And prior to that had been a truck driver for 15 years. Classic serial killer job. His wife was a nurse, and I never met anyone else in my life that creeped me out like her. Something was off with her. Something very, very fake. He installed deadbolts on his door without asking the landlord, would get weird about his tool bag as he walked up the steps, put cardboard up on his utility van window. All things that either someone paranoid would do, or a serial killer. Sometimes he would just swing his door open at night and stand in the hall for a good 3 minutes before shutting his door again. He would go off on angry rants out of nowhere, was very off-putting at times, at other times seemed 100% normal. When he smiled, he always had this intense anger behind his eyes. He would tell jokes that made no sense, and then laugh really loud, and then glare off into the distance. He eventually retired and moved back in with his wife. When my sister and I were about 5 and 6, we lived in a small town community, about 600 people, and we would frequently play outside without parental supervision. Our neighbor would, unbeknownst to our mother, take us to the local ice cream shop for ice cream. One day we moved without explanation. Years later it was told to us that that neighbor was a registered sex offender and pedophile, and mom moved for our safety. She freaked out when she learned about our trips to the ice cream shop. To my knowledge neither me or my sister were ever assaulted, but it is still very scary to think about. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to consider the idea to maybe think about potentially subscribing. Peace.